The morning sun spilled over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across freshly trimmed lawns and pristine driveways. My home sat at the edge of the cul-de-sac, a little older than most but well kept in its own charming way. I'd bought it for the promise of peace. A place to unwind after long workdays and build memories that weren't tied to the city's endless noise. For the first year, it felt exactly like that haven. Then Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the homeowners association, began to take notice of me. At first, her presence was little more than a wave across the street or a forced smile when our paths crossed. But soon, the notes began appearing in my mailbox, each folded with surgical precision and dripping with disapproval. The first note mentioned my fence needing a fresh coat of paint. A week later, she complained about the color of my shutters. Then came the absurd accusations. My lawn was half an inch too long, my garbage cans visible for 30 seconds too long after pickup. I tried to comply, even laughed about it with neighbors who'd been in her crosshairs before. But Karen wasn't looking for cooperation. She was looking for control. She'd show up at HOA meetings like a monarch in a tailored blazer, her voice sharp enough to cut glass as she rattled off rule after obscure rule. By midsummer, the tension was impossible to ignore. I found myself checking the driveway for her car before stepping outside. Friends joked that I lived under surveillance, and they weren't wrong. Karen's eyes seemed to track every move I made, and behind her polite grin was an energy that felt far more sinister than simple neighborhood pride. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the opening act of a much darker conflict. As summer rolled on, Karen's obsession with micromanaging my life escalated from petty nuisances to a daily siege. Each morning, I braced myself before opening the mailbox, knowing I'd likely find another meticulously typed violation notice. One day it was a fine for excessive sidewalk chalk residue, after my niece visited. Another day it was a warning about the inappropriate color temperature of my porch light bulb. At first I tried to laugh it off, but the laughter quickly gave way to a simmering frustration. Karen's tactics grew bolder. She began snapping photos of my property from across the street, her phone angled just so, as if she were documenting evidence for a courtroom drama. I caught her once at dusk, crouched near my hedge with a clipboard. When I stepped outside to confront her, she straightened with an icy smile and claimed she was protecting community standards. My neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors, but few dared to challenge her publicly. Her reputation for retaliation was well earned. The HOA meetings became an ordeal. Karen would sit at the head of the long folding table like a queen on a plastic throne, rattling off rules with a voice sharpened by authority. I attended one out of a sense of duty, and was met with thinly veiled barbs about certain residents who think they're above the bylaws. Her eyes flicked to me with every remark, daring me to speak. I stayed quiet, but inside, a plan was forming. By late August, I'd begun documenting every letter, every photo, every snide remark. I saved emails and even installed a small security camera near the front porch. Something about Karen's relentless intrusion felt less like neighborhood maintenance and more like a looming threat. I couldn't explain it yet, but instinct told me this was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. The evening of the monthly HOA meeting arrived with the heavy weight of a storm about to break. I'd almost skipped it, tired of the endless nitpicking, but something inside me insisted I attend. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed as I walked in, the air thick with the faint scent of burnt coffee and tension. Karen sat at the head of the long table, flanked by two board members who looked more like reluctant accomplices than enthusiastic allies. Her blazer was a sharp shade of crimson, a not-so-subtle signal that tonight she meant business. The meeting began with routine updates, landscaping budgets, holiday decoration schedules, but her eyes kept finding me across the room. When the agenda shifted to residential compliance, Karen's voice hardened. She launched into a litany of alleged violations, each one more exaggerated than the last. Repeated fence height discrepancies, she declared, holding up a stack of photos. Excessive outdoor lighting creating a public nuisance, she continued, her gaze pinning me in place like a moth beneath glass. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware of the spectacle she was making. I tried to respond calmly, explaining that I had fixed the minor issues weeks ago, but she cut me off with a smug wave of her hand. Intent isn't compliance. she snapped, savoring the ripple of discomfort she caused. The humiliation was deliberate. She read out supposed fines in front of everyone, as if rehearsing for some grand punishment. But while she reveled in her performance, I quietly noted every word. My phone discreetly recorded the entire exchange from my pocket. Her hostility wasn't just petty anymore. It was aggressive, personal. As I walked out after adjournment, the night air felt sharper, colder. That meeting cemented my resolve. Karen wasn't merely enforcing rules. She was waging a personal war. And I knew I'd need every shred of evidence to protect myself from whatever came next. The night of the fire began like any other. Quiet, almost unnervingly so. A heavy summer humidity clung to the air, and the cicadas droned their steady chorus outside my open bedroom window. I had just settled in with a book when a faint crackling sound broke through the night. At first I thought it was the distant pop of fireworks, but then came the unmistakable scent of smoke, sharp and acrid. My heart lurched. I leapt from bed and pulled back the curtains. A dull orange glow pulsed against the darkness, growing brighter by the second. Flames licked the side of my garage, twisting upward with terrifying speed. Panic surged through me as I ran down the hallway, pounding on my daughter's door and shouting for everyone to get out. My hands trembled as I dialed 911, the dispatcher's calm voice barely cutting through the roar of my own pulse. The heat was suffocating as we bolted out the front door, barefoot and frantic. The driveway was already alive with embers, tiny sparks floating like malicious fireflies. Neighbors spilled from their homes, faces pale in the flickering light. Someone dragged a garden hose across the lawn, but the water hissed uselessly against the inferno. The fire was too powerful, too fast. I stood frozen for a moment, watching everything I had built. The walls that held family photos, the kitchen where we'd shared countless dinners, collapse into a searing wall of flame. The smell of burning wood and melting plastic filled the night, thick enough to sting my eyes and throat. In the distance, sirens wailed closer, but it felt as though time had slowed. As the fire consumed the house I once called a sanctuary, a cold thought settled in my mind. This wasn't an accident. The precision, the suddenness, something about it felt deliberate, like a message sent in fire. Morning light revealed a nightmare made real. Where my home once stood proud and familiar, only a blackened skeleton remained, its charred beams jutting skyward like broken ribs. Ash coated everything. The driveway, the mailbox, even the trees that had shaded the yard for years. The smell of smoke clung to the air, heavy and bitter, seeping into my clothes and skin. Firefighters had worked through the night, but their efforts left only smoldering remnants and pools of muddy water. I walked carefully through the wreckage with a fire marshal by my side, every step crunching over glass and soot. Memories surfaced with each ruinous sight. The warped frame of the kitchen table where we'd shared Sunday breakfasts, the twisted metal of my daughter's bicycle, the melted remnants of picture frames that once held family smiles. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to keep looking. Something inside me needed answers more than comfort. The marshal crouched near the garage and frowned. "Accelerant patterns," he murmured, pointing to a strange residue. The word landed like a hammer. Accelerant. Not an electrical fault, not a stray ember from a neighbor's barbecue. Someone had helped this fire grow. Near the charred porch, I spotted a small, familiar object. A brass lighter, scratched but intact, its engraving faintly recognizable. My breath caught. I had never owned a lighter. Beside it, faint but undeniable, were footprints in the soot. Too small for the firefighters' heavy boots, almost delicate. Insurance investigators began their own survey, snapping photos and collecting debris. One of them mentioned the possibility of arson, their tone clinical but decisive. I felt the cold certainty settle deeper. This was no tragic accident. Someone had meant for this to happen. And in the hollow silence of the ruined house, a single name echoed in my mind, sharp and accusing: Karen. The following days blurred into a haze of interviews, paperwork, and relentless questions, but each hour brought stronger proof that the fire had been no accident. The fire marshal returned with a preliminary report, his expression grave as he explained that chemical accelerants had been found in several locations: garage, back porch, even near the living room windows. "Multiple ignition points," he said, his voice low. "Someone wanted this house to burn fast." The words hit harder than the smoke ever had. Insurance adjusters combed the property, photographing every scorched inch while investigators gathered samples for lab analysis. One officer mentioned that the residue matched common lighter fluid. Another showed me a set of still images captured by a neighbor's motion-activated camera. The grainy footage wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to make my heart stop. A figure moved along the side of my property minutes before the flames erupted. Shoulders squared, hair pulled back in a neat bun, the silhouette hauntingly familiar. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, and stories began to trickle in. A teenage neighbor recalled seeing Karen's distinctive SUV creeping past my house late that evening. Another remembered her arguing with a landscaper about unsightly houses lowering property values just a day prior. Each detail tightened the knot in my stomach. Meanwhile, Karen carried on as though nothing had happened. I saw her across the street once, smiling faintly while chatting with another board member. No condolences, no acknowledgement of the devastation. Her calmness chilled me more than the charred ruins behind me. I compiled everything, security footage, photos of the lighter, every complaint she had ever filed against me, and handed it to the detectives. As the evidence mounted, my grief hardened into resolve. This wasn't just about a burned home anymore. It was about justice. Karen might have believed she was untouchable, but I was ready to prove her. With the investigation pointing unmistakably toward arson, I knew waiting on the authorities alone wasn't enough. I contacted a seasoned attorney recommended by a friend, a sharp-minded woman named Elena who specialized in property disputes and criminal cases. We met in a quiet corner of her office, the walls lined with shelves of thick legal volumes. After I explained everything, the HOA battles, the endless fines, the mounting evidence, she leaned forward and said, "We'll file a civil suit for damages and push for criminal prosecution. People like her count on intimidation to keep you quiet. Don't give her that power." Elena wasted no time. Together we organized every shred of documentation. The stack of HOA letters, the audio recording from the meeting where Karen publicly humiliated me, and the footage of that shadowy figure near my house minutes before the blaze. She hired a private investigator to double-check the fire marshal's findings and gather witness statements. Neighbors who once avoided conflict began stepping forward, offering stories of Karen's late-night prowling and her threats about cleaning up the neighborhood. Their willingness to speak bolstered the case and strengthened my resolve. The HOA board tried to distance itself, sending polite emails about neutrality, while quietly hoping the scandal wouldn't drag them down. But whispers spread. Homeowners began questioning Karen's leadership and reviewing bylaws that granted her so much unchecked authority. A few even admitted they'd been fined or harassed for trivial reasons, but had been too afraid to confront her. By the end of the month, Elena filed the lawsuit and formally requested that the district attorney pursue criminal charges. Subpoenas went out, and a court date was set. For the first time since the fire, I felt a flicker of control returning. Karen might still act untouchable, but the walls were closing in, and soon she would have to answer for every spark she had ignited. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and tension when I arrived early that morning. A stack of carefully prepared evidence clutched in my hands. My attorney, Elena, greeted me with a firm nod and a quiet assurance. "Today we show the truth." The courtroom filled quickly, neighbors curious to witness the showdown, reporters sensing a story, and even a few HOA board members who avoided my eyes as they slipped into the back row. Then the door at the side swung open and Karen walked in. Every inch the self-appointed queen. She wore a tailored navy suit and a confident smirk, as though the entire proceeding were a minor inconvenience. Not a flicker of regret crossed her face when she caught sight of me. Instead, she gave a tiny, almost mocking nod, as if we were sharing some private joke. My stomach tightened, but I held my gaze steady. The prosecution opened with the fire marshal's report, displaying photographs of multiple ignition points and chemical residues on a large screen. The jury leaned forward as experts testified that the blaze had been deliberately set using lighter fluid. Next came the grainy yet unmistakable security footage. A woman with Karen's distinctive posture and hair pulled into a tight bun slipping through the shadows of my property. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Elena followed with a parade of witnesses. Neighbors who described Karen's threats, her obsessive late-night drives, and her outbursts at HOA meetings. Each testimony chipped away at the veneer of innocence she wore. I watched the confidence drain from Karen's expression, her smirk faltering as the weight of evidence mounted. By the time the prosecution rested, the once commanding HOA president looked smaller somehow, like a figure whose power had finally begun to crumble under the harsh light of truth. The courtroom was hushed when the jury filed back in, every footstep echoing against the polished wood. I sat rigid beside Elena, palms damp despite the cool air. Karen, still in her crisp navy suit, stared straight ahead, her jaw tight as stone. The foreperson handed a folded sheet to the judge, who unfolded it with deliberate care. The pause before he read the verdict stretched like a taut wire. Guilty on all counts of arson and property destruction. The words struck the room like a thunderclap. A collective gasp followed, then a stunned silence. My chest loosened for the first time in weeks. Across the aisle, Karen's composure cracked. Her eyes widened in disbelief, lips parting as if to argue with the inevitable. When the bailiff approached to escort her out, she stiffened, still clinging to the illusion of control. But her trembling hands betrayed her. The judge's voice remained steady as he announced her sentence: a lengthy prison term and full restitution for damages. The HOA's board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware that their complicity, or at least their silence, would face public scrutiny. Reporters rushed toward me as the court adjourned, their questions a blur. I answered only a few, focusing on gratitude for the investigators, the neighbors who came forward, and the justice system that had listened. Behind me, Karen was led away in handcuffs, her once commanding presence reduced to a shadow of arrogance and regret. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun felt different, warmer, freer. Neighbors gathered to offer hugs and words of support, many confessing relief that Karen's reign of intimidation had finally ended. For the first time since the fire, I felt a genuine sense of peace. Justice had not only been served, it had lifted an entire community from under Karen's oppressive grip. Rebuilding began slowly, like stitching a wound after a deep cut. The insurance payout covered the basics, but what mattered most were the neighbors who showed up with work gloves, paintbrushes, and warm meals. Where fear once kept doors shut, a new spirit of cooperation blossomed. People who had only nodded politely before now lingered to share stories, trade advice, or simply offer a kind word. The hollow lot that had been my home gradually transformed from a scar of ash into a hive of determined activity. I spent countless evenings at the construction site, watching the new frame rise where blackened beams had fallen. Each nail hammered, and every wall raised felt like a quiet victory over the destruction Karen had tried to leave behind. My daughter chose bright colors for her new room, insisting we plant a small garden beneath her window. Something that always grows back, she said with a hopeful smile. The HOA, stripped of its tyrannical leader, held emergency elections. Fresh faces stepped forward. People committed to fair treatment and open dialogue instead of intimidation. New bylaws limited the board's power and ensured transparency. The community that once cowered under Karen's scrutiny was finally breathing freely. Months later, when we moved back into the finished house, I paused at the front door, running a hand over the smooth wood. It wasn't the same house I had lost, but it carried something stronger. The weight of resilience and the warmth of solidarity. Standing in the quiet evening light, I realized the fire hadn't just destroyed a home. It had sparked a transformation. I had faced loss, fear, and a bitter enemy, but I'd also gained a deeper connection to my neighbors and a renewed faith in justice. From ashes, a stronger life had truly begun.